Tonight, we drift back through the corridors of time into a world lit by flickering candles and scented with burning tallow, where tapestries whispered of ancient battles and kings moved like giants across a fragile earth. And in that world of secrets and splendor, where the church towered over the lives of every ordinary soul, there was a palace beside a river, calm on the outside, yet filled with restless ambition within. It was here, at Greenwich, that a child was born, who would one day shake the very foundations of England. He entered the world on a warm summer morning, a morning when the sun fell softly on the River Thames, and the court gathered in anxious anticipation. The infant was robust, red-cheeked, and healthy, a welcome sight after the sorrows and uncertainties that had haunted the Tudor family during the long, violent years before their rise to power. This baby was Henry, the second son of King Henry VII and Queen Elizabeth of York. The rooms around him were filled with velvet cushions, golden cradles, and the murmurs of noble women who believed this child would live a comfortable life in the shadow of his elder brother, not knowing that history had other plans. As Henry grew, the world he inhabited shaped him with care and contradiction. He was brilliant, bright-eyed, quick to laugh. Tutors flocked to him from Italy, Spain, France, and the Low Countries. They brought with them languages, philosophy, religious doctrine, mathematics, poetry, everything the Renaissance thought worth teaching to a prince. He absorbed knowledge with startling speed. While most children struggled with Latin declensions, Henry recited complex phrases with a natural confidence. Where others battled to master the lute, Henry picked it up and played as though he had been born with strings beneath his fingers. Courtiers would whisper behind their hands that the young prince could easily have become a scholar, a musician, or a theologian if he had not been born into royalty. But it was not only books that captured his attention. Henry was strong, tall, and full of restless energy. He wrestled with older boys, raced on horseback, practiced archery until his arms ached, and dreamed of tournaments where he would one day ride out in gleaming armor, cheered on by thousands. He wanted to be admired, not merely obeyed. He wanted to be a hero. Yet even in these early years, there was something else stirring in him, a deep hunger for approval, a longing to be seen as exceptional, not simply good enough. His father, King Henry VII, was a cautious ruler, shaped by war and betrayal. He had watched friends die, watched loyalties crumble, and had clawed his way onto the throne through grit and luck. To him, the world was a place of danger. To young Henry, it was a stage waiting for applause. This difference created a silent distance between father and son. The king kept Henry tightly controlled, hidden behind layers of protection. He did not send him to face councils or hard decisions. He did not let him test the edges of power. He feared losing the boy, feared repeating the losses he had already endured. And so the prince, brilliant and eager, spent much of his youth performing in chapels, practicing in courtyards, learning from tutors, but never ruling anything more important than a pageant or a scholarship contest. Then came tragedy. His older brother Arthur, the heir to the throne, married Catherine of Aragon in a magnificent ceremony filled with silk, incense, and diplomatic hope. But within months, Arthur fell ill and died. The court plunged into mourning, and the quiet shift of destiny placed the crown, invisible yet heavy, onto 10-year-old Henry's head. He became the Prince of Wales, a role he did not yet fully understand, but one that would define every breath he took from that moment on. His father, sensing danger and opportunity intertwined, tightened his hold further. Henry was given titles, responsibilities on paper, but kept far from any real decision-making. Perhaps the king believed he was shielding him. Perhaps he feared the new heir's naivety. But for Henry, the world must have felt like a puzzle where every piece fit except the one he most desired. He was loved, but not trusted, brilliant, but not empowered, a prince, but not yet a man. At 14, when the idea arose that he might marry Catherine of Aragon, the widow of his brother, Henry protested loudly, as any uncertain adolescent might. Yet time passed, negotiations twisted and turned, and somewhere in the maze of diplomacy, Henry's wishes mattered less than the political ties England needed to preserve. In 1509, the old king died, and suddenly everything opened. 17-year-old Henry became King of England, lord of a kingdom that had long waited for a golden youth to lift it out of caution and into glory. Crowds flooded London's streets, calling his name, praising his beauty, marveling at his broad shoulders, his athletic stride, and his charming smile. The kingdom felt reborn. Bells rang, banners fluttered, and the excitement of the people seemed endless, as though England herself sighed in relief that the sombre reign of Henry VII had finally ended. Henry married Catherine of Aragon shortly afterward. The wedding was filled with solemn vows and glittering celebration. Catherine, dignified and gently beautiful, wore her Spanish heritage like a cloak of quiet strength. She had known sorrow, known political uncertainty, yet carried herself with grace. Their coronation at Westminster Abbey was breathtaking. Silk tapestries hung from balconies, golden cloth gleamed in the sun, and the scent of roses and incense filled the air. To the people watching, it must have looked like a fairy tale. A young, handsome king, a noble, beloved queen, a nation poised for greatness. Those early years of marriage truly were filled with warmth. Henry adored Catherine. They prayed together, debated theology, laughed during feasts, walked through gardens, and seemed for a while to share mutual affection and respect. But beneath the harmony, pressure tightened like an invisible hand around the king's heart. Henry needed a son. A male heir meant security, legacy, stability. Without one, every noble ambition, every dream he had for England felt threatened. Catherine's pregnancies became moments of hope, followed painfully by despair. She lost babies to miscarriage, stillbirth, and death in infancy. Only one child survived, Mary. Henry loved her, but she was not the son he yearned for. As the years passed, frustration gnawed at him. Doubts grew. Had God cursed their marriage? Was Catherine's union with his brother the reason heaven denied them a prince? And into this fragile emotional landscape came political ambition. Henry was young, powerful, and desperate to prove himself. He wanted glory, wanted to carve his name beside legendary kings. He looked toward France, as so many English monarchs had before him, and imagined banners fluttering, cannons firing, and chroniclers writing his victories in proud ink. War followed. Henry marched into France with an army, hungry for triumph. Even small victories were transformed by his court into grand tales. Meanwhile, Catherine, left behind, showed a strength few expected. When Scotland invaded, she commanded England's defence with remarkable composure. She oversaw troops, made decisions, and guided the nation to victory. The Scottish king fell in battle, and England rejoiced in Catherine's leadership. For a time, Their partnership held firm, yet the cracks that had begun forming earlier widened with every year that passed. And then came the moment that would alter everything. At a lavish pageant, bright lights, shimmering fabrics, masked dancers, music echoing through vaulted halls, Henry's eyes fell upon a young woman with dark hair and an elegant bearing. Anne Boleyn, not the typical docile court lady, but sharp, confident, educated, playful, and entirely unlike Catherine. Anne did not bow easily. She did not surrender. She did not melt under the king's gaze. And because she held herself with dignity, Henry wanted her more fiercely than he had ever wanted anything. What began as fascination grew into obsession. An obsession for a king with unchecked power was a dangerous thing. Anne Boleyn entered Henry's world, not like a gentle breeze, but like a sudden shift in the room's light. Subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. She had returned from the French court with a polished grace that English courtiers found rare. There was French charm in her gestures, elegance in her speech, wit in her laughter, and an unmistakable confidence in the way she moved through the hall. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense the poets praised, but she possessed something far more dangerous: presence. In a court used to women who bowed and murmured and obeyed, Anne was a flame in a room full of candles, small, controlled, but hypnotic. She knew when to speak, when to remain silent, when to challenge lightly, and when to let her silence stoke curiosity. She was not a woman to be conquered in a night. She was a woman to be pursued. And for Henry, who had always gotten what he wanted, that made her irresistible. At first, their interactions were fleeting: a glance across a crowded hall, an exchange of polite conversation at a feast, a shared smile during a pageant. But soon, Henry's attention began to turn frequently toward her. He sent her letters, earnest, passionate, overflowing with longing, begging her to return his affection. She replied with caution, knowing that yielding too quickly would seal her fate as just another forgotten mistress. Instead, she had the courage to say no, not with cruelty, but with calculation. She insisted she would not be his lover. She would be his wife, or nothing at all. It was a bold stance, almost unthinkable for a woman in her position. And yet Henry did not turn away from her ambition. It only fed his desire. As months passed, the king's obsession thickened like fog rolling in from the river. Catherine, noble, older, steady, became a distant note in Henry's mind. The throne he had built with her seemed suddenly incomplete, as though destiny were calling him toward another path entirely. In Anne, he saw not only romance, but renewal, a second chance at youth, at passion, at legacy. She was a symbol of everything he believed he deserved, but had not yet achieved. But beneath the personal longing lay a deeper, darker tension. Catherine had failed to give him a male heir. Anne was young, fertile, vibrant. Henry convinced himself that with Anne, he would finally be granted the son God owed him. And once a man decides that heaven itself supports his desires, the walls of morality begin to crumble. Henry's court buzzed with whispers. Some women envied Anne, some despised her. Men watched cautiously, calculating their positions and alliances. Councillors debated in quiet chambers, realizing the king's obsession was leading him down a path from which he could not easily return. Yet no one dared speak too loudly against Anne. The king's affection was becoming too visible, too powerful. Catherine, meanwhile, remained steadfast. She loved Henry, or at the very least believed deeply in the sanctity of their marriage. She prayed for him, pleaded with him privately, and refused every suggestion that she step aside. Her dignity never fractured, even as she grew isolated. Each passing day, each affectionate word Henry spoke to Anne, each cold gesture he made toward Catherine, drove the tension deeper into the heart of the English court. Henry saw himself as a man facing divine injustice. If God wanted him to have a son, but his marriage produced only sorrow, then surely God did not approve of the marriage. And so Henry reached for Scripture, not lightly, but fiercely, searching for confirmation of what he already felt. He found a verse warning that a man who marries his brother's widow will be childless. To Henry, this was divine proof. To Catherine, it was a twisting of truth. Her first marriage to Arthur had not been consummated. She swore this with unwavering certainty. And even if it had been, marriage laws were far more complex than Henry chose to admit. But truths had begun to matter less to the king than justification. What followed was a long, tangled battle that stretched across Europe. Henry appealed to the Pope for an annulment of his marriage. He expected obedience. Instead, he encountered resistance. The Pope was caught in the political grip of Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. Granting an annulment would weaken imperial honor. Refusing it enraged the King of England. Months turned into years. Letters crossed seas. Arguments filled halls. Courts convened, stalled, dissolved, and reconvened. Nothing moved. And all the while, Anne remained at the heart of Henry's thoughts, her refusal still burning in his pride. The more unattainable she seemed, the more he tied her to his destiny. He saw visions of a future shaped by her presence, a son in her arms, a new dynasty ushered in by love and providence. Or so he convinced himself. As Henry's pressure grew, so too did the discomfort of those around him. Cardinals, bishops, and scholars found themselves caught between their loyalty to the king and their loyalty to Rome. The kingdom became divided, nobles whispering in corners, churchmen debating furiously, ambassadors sending secret reports overseas. Catherine stood firm. Anne stood defiant. Henry stood at the center, restless, pacing like a lion trapped in a gilded cage. At last, weary of waiting, he began to ask a question that would change England forever. Why should a foreign priest decide the fate of an English king? Henry argued that his authority came directly from God, and that no earthly power, not even Rome, had the right to stand between a king and his conscience. Advisors like Thomas Cromwell saw opportunity in this idea. Slowly, carefully, the foundations of England's allegiance to the Pope began to crack. Laws were drafted that limited Rome's power. Appeals to the Pope were forbidden. Clergy were pressured to acknowledge the king's supremacy. One by one, the old pillars of Catholic authority in England began to weaken. Anne's influence, too, played a role. She supported religious reform, encouraged the reading of English scriptures, and fostered discussions about corruption within the church. Some saw her as a force of enlightenment. Others saw her as a serpent whispering temptation into the king's ear. Whichever truth one believed, there was no denying her impact. Her name was spoken everywhere, on the lips of bishops, in the whispers of servants, in foreign courts that wondered how one woman had managed to ignite such monumental change. And then came a moment from which there could be no return. Henry secretly married Anne Boleyn. The ceremony was held quietly, away from prying eyes. No fanfare, no tapestries, no grand celebration. Just a king determined to claim the woman he desired, and a woman determined to become Queen of England. Soon after, Anne was publicly crowned, her belly rounded with the king's child, a child both believed would be the long-awaited male heir. The court watched, breath held, as the future seemed poised to unfold exactly as Henry had imagined. When the child was born, England trembled with anticipation. But the newborn was not a prince. She was a daughter, a girl who would someday become Elizabeth I, one of the greatest rulers in English history. But at the time of her birth, she was a disappointment, the first crack in Henry's dream. Yet the king did not give up hope. Anne became pregnant again, then again. Each time he waited for the universe to reward his sacrifice. Each time, fate denied him. And around the court, enemies multiplied. Anne's sharp tongue, her fiery temper, her refusal to be silent, qualities that had once enchanted Henry, now irritated him. Her intelligence, once a delight, now seemed like insolence. Her independence, once refreshing, now felt threatening. The courtiers who had once bowed deeply before her now waited eagerly for her downfall. In her rise, she had stepped on many toes. In her reign, she had insulted many egos. And in her struggles, she had offered her enemies the scent of blood. Meanwhile, Henry changed. The young king who had danced across banquet halls was fading. The bitterness of years spent chasing an heir had hardened him. The power he wielded without resistance had inflated his pride. His conviction that he acted on God's authority made him ruthless. The break with Rome had given him a taste of absolute control, and once tasted, absolute control does not easily loosen its grip. The stage was being set. Whispers were growing. Anne's time was running out. And soon, England would witness a fall as dramatic as her rise. A fall that would stain Henry's reign forever. A fall that would echo through every Tudor palace like a cursed wind. Anne Boleyn's rise had been meteoric, breathtaking, and controversial. But her fall would be even more swift, more shocking, and far more brutal than anyone at court dared whisper aloud. From the moment she became queen, the ground beneath her was already shifting, unstable, trembling with the weight of her enemies' resentment. Court factions that had felt sidelined, noble families whose influence had been eclipsed, religious traditionalists furious about Henry's break from Rome, and even commoners who adored Catherine of Aragon, all watched Anne with cold suspicion. And when her pregnancies failed to deliver a son, their whispers sharpened like the edge of a sword. Inside the gilded walls of the palace, tension coiled like a serpent. Anne's relationship with Henry had once been built on spark, wit, and the intoxicating thrill of defiance. But now that she was queen, the charm that had enchanted the king became a mirror reflecting everything he now disliked about her. She challenged him, questioned him, debated theology at the dinner table, and spoke her mind in front of courtiers. She was too bold, too clever, too involved. Henry, who once adored her fire, now longed for calm, for obedience, for silence. Anne's every move was observed, every sigh interpreted. Every argument with the king became a rumor in the corridors. Her enemies, who had waited like wolves in the shadows, began to scheme with renewed confidence. They knew Henry needed only one nudge, one believable accusation, to turn on the woman who had once inflamed his imagination. The turning point came quietly, almost invisibly, like a shift in the weather. Anne miscarried a male child. It happened after she heard devastating news that Henry had fallen during a jousting tournament and was feared dead. The shock had been so severe that she collapsed, and in the days following, the unborn child, the son who could have secured her future, was lost. In that moment, Henry's disappointment hardened into something colder, something unspoken, something dangerous. Court gossip ignited like dry leaves. Whispers accused her of flirtation, of manipulation, of witchcraft, a medieval accusation used as a political dagger. Some said she enchanted the king. Others whispered she carried deformities. None of it was true, but truth mattered little when ambition and fear ruled the day. Thomas Cromwell, the king's most powerful advisor and the architect of many reforms, found himself drifting away from Anne. Their visions for England no longer aligned. Where she wanted to direct church wealth toward education and charity, Cromwell wanted total control of monastic riches. Their rivalry deepened quietly until it was no longer a rivalry at all. It was a countdown. Slowly, cunningly, he began collecting fragments of gossip, a smile here, a too friendly exchange there, a misplaced joke, a courtier lingering too long near the queen. These fragments, flimsy on their own, were woven into a net. A deadly net that Cromwell would place at Henry's feet. The king, restless and disillusioned, did not resist it. In fact, he welcomed it. A man who feels betrayed does not ask for proof. He asks for justification. One by one, the Queen's alleged lovers were named. Mark Smeaton, a musician, Sir Francis Weston, William Brereton, Henry Norris, one of the King's closest friends, and most shockingly, Anne's own brother, George Boleyn. The accusations were grotesque, unbelievable, treason, adultery, incest, but they served a purpose for those who wanted Anne gone. Henry demanded to know nothing more. The God-fearing prince of his youth had become a monarch convinced that his will reflected divine judgment. Anne was arrested. On the morning, her guards approached. She was seated in her chamber, reading her prayer book. The sound of boots, the rustle of armor, the solemn expressions, she knew instantly that her fate had arrived. They escorted her to the Tower of London, through the same gates she had entered triumphantly before her coronation. But now there were no trumpets, no cheers, only silence and the echo of her footsteps. Inside the cold stone walls, the queen who had once worn silks and jewels suddenly felt the fragility of her existence. She prayed, she cried, she pleaded with God. Yet when questioned, she held herself with remarkable dignity. Her words were clear, her mind intact, her innocence unwavering. Even her enemies were taken aback by her composure. George Boleyn, eloquent and brave, defended himself fiercely, but it mattered little. The trials were orchestrated, the verdicts predetermined. The Tudor court was a place where justice bent easily to the king's will. When Anne was brought to trial, she stood before her accusers with a calmness that remains legendary. Her beauty, once a threat, now seemed tragic. She denied every accusation with unwavering conviction. Those present noted the truth in her voice, the steadiness in her eyes. But truth had no place in a drama already written. She was found guilty. And for those who had pushed for her downfall, there was relief. For those who had served her, there was heartbreak. For Henry, there was something far more complex. A mixture of anger, disappointment, guilt, and a strange emerging eagerness for freedom. Freedom to marry again. Freedom to try once more for a son. On the morning of her execution, Anne dressed in a simple grey gown. She asked for her lady's forgiveness for the trouble she had caused. She prayed, and when she stepped onto the scaffold, she faced the crowd with dignified serenity. A gentle breeze lifted her veil. The sky above London was clear and bright, as though indifferent to human sorrow. Her final words praised Henry. She asked God to bless him, protect him, and give him a long reign. Whether she spoke from love, fear, or calculation, no one knows. But those who listened could not help but feel their hearts tighten. A skilled French swordsman had been brought to grant her a swift, clean death. She knelt, murmured prayers, and in a single blur of movement, her life ended. In the crowd, women gasped, men lowered their heads. The air itself seemed to still. The king who had once loved her now turned his gaze to another. Less than 24 hours after Anne's death, Henry was already preparing to marry Jane Seymour, a quiet, gentle woman whose simplicity soothed the king's bruised pride. Jane's calmness was a balm after Anne's fiery brilliance. Her softness felt like peace. Her obedience felt like stability. And so Anne Boleyn's story ended, not with the triumph she had imagined, but with the tragic clarity of a candle being snuffed out. Yet her legacy had only begun. Her daughter would one day become Elizabeth I, the greatest monarch England had ever known. But for now, the court moved on, quickly, brutally, as if Anne had never existed. Henry, meanwhile, was changing, growing older, growing heavier, growing darker, and soon the king's hunger for an heir, for immortality, would once again reshape England's fate. Jane Seymour entered Henry's life like a quiet dawn after a violent storm, soft, pale, and seemingly gentle enough to soothe a king whose heart had become jagged with disappointment. Where Anne had sparked fire, Jane brought calm. Where Anne had argued, Jane bowed. Where Anne had challenged, Jane listened. And Henry, exhausted from the chaos of the last years, clung to that softness like a man desperate for stillness after spiraling through thunder. The court breathed easier in Jane's presence. Her modest smile, her careful words, her lack of ambition, at least outwardly, shifted the atmosphere inside the palace. Servants whispered that she was the opposite of Anne, and many nobles, especially those loyal to Catherine of Aragon, greeted her with relief. They saw in Jane a return to stability, to tradition, to a quieter, more obedient model of queenship. Henry married her less than 2 weeks after Anne's execution. The speed shocked Europe, but Henry justified it as the will of God. God had freed him from a cursed marriage and offered him a pure, meek bride who would surely give him the son he deserved. The king believed this with the same fervor he applied to everything that aligned with his desire. In these early months of marriage, Henry was tender with Jane, speaking softly to her, offering her jewels and estates, praising her gentle nature in front of courtiers. He declared that she was his true wife, framing the previous 2 marriages as errors. In private, though, he remained restless. The ghost of Anne lingered in shadows, not because Henry loved her still, but because her memory clung to the edges of the court, whispered in corridors, murmured by foreign ambassadors, written in coded letters abroad. Jane understood this. She understood everything, perhaps more than she let on. Beneath her quiet demeanor was a sharp intelligence, the intelligence of someone who watched first and spoke second, someone who learned from the mistakes of others. She said nothing controversial. She made no enemies. She did not involve herself heavily in foreign affairs. She did not challenge Henry's decisions. And yet, she exercised influence in the one area where Henry's heart remained soft, his daughters. Jane encouraged reconciliation. She spoke kindly of Princess Mary. She persuaded Henry to allow Mary to return to court after years of estrangement. Mary, grateful yet cautious, found in Jane a type of motherly gentleness she had not known since Catherine's death. This pleased Henry, who, despite his pride, felt a deep-rooted affection for his eldest daughter. Elizabeth, however, remained an uncomfortable topic, an echo of Anne. But Jane, patient and careful, avoided provoking Henry's temper. She never pressed too hard. She simply nudged the king's heart, here and there, allowing healing to seep into wounds he preferred not to look at. But all of this, the peacemaking, the gentle diplomacy, was secondary to the one thing everyone in England watched with bated breath: Jane's pregnancy. When Jane finally conceived, the entire kingdom held its breath. Bells rang preemptively. Prayers were whispered in every church. Courtiers walked quietly, as though a single loud footstep might disturb the fragile promise of a future prince. Even Henry softened, hovering around Jane like a man guarding his last hope. 9 long months passed. Jane grew pale but radiant, her body bearing the weight not only of the child, but of an entire nation's expectations. When the labor came, it was protracted and agonizing. Reports circulated of the Queen suffering for hours, then days. But on a crisp October morning in 1537, Jane Seymour gave Henry what neither of his previous wives could: a son. Edward, a prince, a living heir. The child Henry had pursued through 2 broken marriages, political chaos, war with Rome, and uncountable personal sacrifices. Henry wept when he saw the baby. He lifted the infant in his arms and proclaimed him the answer to years of prayer. Across England, church bells rang, celebrations erupted, great bonfires were lit in streets and villages. England rejoiced as though peace had finally arrived. But fate had a cruel habit of twisting joy into anguish in Henry's life. Jane grew weak. Infection crept into her body silently, like a shadow slipping under a door. Doctors came and went. Prayers multiplied. Henry refused to consider the possibility of losing her. But as days passed, Jane's strength faded. Her breathing grew shallow. Her eyes dulled. On the 12th day after Edward's birth, Jane Seymour, Queen of England, died. The palace fell silent. Henry locked himself away, consumed by grief. Servants tiptoed through the halls. Mary and Elizabeth mourned quietly, for Jane had shown kindness to both. And the country, which had celebrated so loudly days before, now hung its head. For the first time in many years, Henry was truly broken. Jane had been the only wife to give him a son, the only wife whose memory he would speak of tenderly for the rest of his life, the only wife whose tomb he would later choose as his own resting place. But Henry's grief, deep as it was, did not soften him. If anything, it hardened him further. Jane's death reopened cracks in his soul that power and marriage had temporarily patched. The loneliness he had tried to ignore returned with sharp teeth. And something else returned too. Something darker. A king who has tasted the heights of joy only to watch it crumble tends to grow suspicious of everything, including fate itself. Henry aged suddenly after Jane's death. His face swelled, his legs ached, his ulcers worsened, his temper sharpened, his appetite grew. The handsome young prince of his youth faded into a heavy, brooding monarch with a widening waistline and a faltering spirit. Yet politically, he remained relentless. His break with Rome had left England vulnerable and financially strained. Monasteries continued to be dissolved, their lands seized, their treasures melted, their libraries scattered. Money flowed into the crown. Power centralized further. Thomas Cromwell, brilliant, ruthless, indispensable, grew more powerful during these years. He reorganized government, expanded royal authority, filled the treasury, and tightened England's new Protestant-leaning identity. But even Cromwell knew that the king's grief made him volatile. A single misstep could cost him everything. And with foreign powers looming, Spain, France, the Holy Roman Empire, alliances had to be strengthened. The king needed another marriage. Henry did not want to search for a bride. But a king does not always have the luxury of choice. And so, across Europe, portraits were requested. Ambassadors wrote flattering descriptions. Artists painted idealized images. Lutherans, Catholics, Protestants, princes, dukes. Many offered daughters as potential queens. It was through one of these portraits that Henry's next great disaster approached him, wrapped in silk and diplomacy, Anne of Cleves. But the king, still scarred from Anne Boleyn's rise and Jane's death, had no idea that another turning point was approaching, one that would shift alliances, unravel loyalties, and begin the slow downfall of the man who had once been his most trusted servant. The wheel of fate was turning again, and this time it would not be a queen who paid the highest price. It would be the king's own architect, Thomas Cromwell. After Jane Seymour's death, a heaviness settled over Henry, like a cloak weighting down his shoulders. The king, who once dazzled Europe with his athleticism, charm, and golden youth, seemed to age a decade in a single year. He limped through palace halls with a stiffness that had not been there before, leaning on canes, grimacing through pain that pulsed from the ulcers on his legs. His once muscular frame thickened, not with strength, but with indulgence. Heavy meals, sweet wines, and the kind of comfort a grieving man grabs onto when everything else feels uncertain. Yet for all his physical decline, Henry remained a king in every sense, unyielding, unpredictable, and in constant need of asserting his power. The realm around him was changing faster than it ever had before. Monasteries continued to crumble. Their stones were sold, their lands were divided, their treasures filled the royal coffers. The English church, forcibly reshaped by Henry's will, was morphing into something new, something neither fully Catholic nor fully Protestant. And in the middle of these seismic shifts stood Thomas Cromwell, the man who had carefully engineered the machinery of Henry's new world. Cromwell had been indispensable, sharp-witted, relentless, visionary. He had guided Henry through legal mazes, political battles, economic reforms, and the dangerous separation from Rome. But as Henry's moods darkened and his patience shrank, even Cromwell understood the precariousness of holding the king's favor. And then came the question that would decide everything. Who would be Henry's next queen? Europe was a chessboard, its pieces shifting as alliances formed and crumbled. Spain and the Holy Roman Empire were powerful. France was unpredictable. Protestant territories in Germany were rising. For England, isolated after breaking from Rome, marriage was not simply personal, it was strategic. Cromwell saw opportunity. He suggested a union with a German princess, Anne of Cleves. Her brother, the Duke of Cleves, was aligned with Protestant forces. Such an alliance would strengthen England against Catholic power blocs. Cromwell believed this match could secure England's political future and stabilize Henry's legacy. Henry, however, was hesitant. He did not relish the idea of marrying again. His heart was still raw, his body was failing him, and he knew that a queen was more than a wife. She was a symbol, a public figure, a mother of heirs. But eventually, persuaded by necessity, he agreed to consider her. Holbein, the famed painter, was sent to capture Anne's likeness. He painted her with dignity, tall, composed, modestly dressed, her expression calm and serene. Courtiers praised her virtues, gentle, kind-hearted, well-mannered, raised in the Protestant discipline. Descriptions reassured Henry that she would be nothing like Anne Boleyn, not sharp-tongued or cunning, and nothing like Catherine Howard, youthful, unpredictable, and reckless. She appeared steady, safe, predictable, and so Henry agreed. But when Anne arrived in England, a cold wave of reality washed over him. Something about her, her manner, her accent, her unfamiliar customs, or perhaps simply the way she carried herself, did not match the vision he had built from Holbein's portrait. Some said he found her unattractive. Some said he found her boring. Others whispered that she smelled unfamiliar to him, or that she did not speak with enough grace. Whatever the truth, the moment Henry saw her, disappointment settled in his heart like a stone. He felt deceived by ambassadors, by portrait artists, and most dangerously, by Cromwell. Still, the marriage went forward. The political stakes were too high, and England's reputation too fragile for Henry to reject her openly. The ceremony was quiet, somber, and awkward, lacking the joy that had coloured his previous weddings. The court watched silently, knowing the king's smile was forced. But behind closed doors, Henry confessed something devastating. He could not consummate the marriage. He claimed Anne repelled him, that she did, not arouse him, that she seemed, his words cruelly chosen, no maid. Whether this was truth, self-delusion, or an excuse crafted from disappointment, no one could say. Anne, for her part, remained gentle and gracious, unaware, or pretending to be unaware, of the king's disdain. The marriage limped through 6 months of tension and embarrassment before Henry demanded release. Cromwell, who had orchestrated the union, suddenly stood on thin ice cracking beneath his feet. The marriage was annulled. Anne was given a generous settlement, and the title, the king's sister. And remarkably, she adapted gracefully to her new life, comfortable, respected, and in no danger. But for Cromwell, the storm clouds had already gathered. Henry needed someone to blame. He needed someone to point to and say, "This was your doing, not mine." Court rivals, especially the conservative nobles led by the Duke of Norfolk, saw their chance. They whispered poison into Henry's ear, twisting Cromwell's many reforms into accusations of treason, heresy, and personal ambition. They painted him as a Protestant radical who had led the king astray. They reminded Henry that Cromwell had pushed for a marriage he now hated, and Henry, whose moods had grown harsher with age, listened. In a shocking twist, Cromwell was arrested in the middle of a council meeting. One moment, he was the most powerful man in England. The next, he was a prisoner dragged to the Tower. Even those who hated him were stunned by how quickly the fall came. Cromwell begged the king for mercy, sending letters filled with desperation, humility, and the memory of years of loyal service. But Henry's heart had hardened. The man who had once dismantled monasteries, crushed rebellions, and restructured England's entire government now awaited the fate he had delivered to so many others. On the day of his execution, Cromwell asked for forgiveness from all he had wronged. He prayed for England, and then the sword fell. Henry, however, had already moved forward, for even as Cromwell's blood stained the ground of the Tower, the king had remarried. Her name was Catherine Howard, young, beautiful, playful, barely 17, and for the aging king, she was nothing short of intoxicating. She was a reminder of youth long lost, of passion, of vitality. Henry adored her with a fervour that startled the court. He called her his rose without a thorn, his jewel, his beloved wife. He lavished her with jewels, estates, gowns, and affection. But beneath the surface of Catherine Howard's charm was a dangerous truth, a truth that would soon unravel into one of the most scandalous tragedies of Henry's reign. For while the king saw her as pure innocence, the court knew better. Secrets from her past lingered. Recklessness simmered beneath her laughter. And enemies, old and new, watched her closely, waiting for the right moment to strike. The king, however, blinded by desire, saw none of it. But fate was preparing its hand. The storm gathering around Catherine would not only devastate the king, it would push him further into the shadows of paranoia, cruelty, and loneliness than ever before. Catherine Howard entered Henry's life like a spark flickering in a dim room, small at first, then mesmerizing, then suddenly too bright for anyone to ignore. She was young, graceful, and full of an effortless charm that came naturally to her, the kind that made older men nostalgic and younger men infatuated. Her laughter spilled lightly through the corridors, her hair shone like polished chestnut, and her movements had the softness of someone who had not yet faced the weight of the world. Compared to the heavy grief hanging over Henry's shoulders, she was almost intoxicating. Henry fell for her swiftly, completely, and without hesitation. To him, she was a reminder of everything he once had been, youthful, energetic, and adored. Even as his legs throbbed with pain, even as ulcers underscored every step he took, even as his face and body swelled with age, he felt younger in Catherine's presence. Her bright eyes and playful nature revived something inside him, something he believed he had lost forever. He showered her with gifts fit for a queen in a fairy tale. Diamonds, emeralds, silks embroidered with gold thread, estates, and gowns so heavy with jewels that they practically shimmered when she walked. The court watched with cautious curiosity. Some admired the new queen's beauty. Others resented her swift rise. But almost everyone feared the intensity of Henry's affection, because affection in Henry's world was not a blessing. It was a test. Catherine, so very young and unprepared, had grown up in the household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, a chaotic environment where discipline was loose and supervision inconsistent. Unlike Anne Boleyn, who had been shaped by the refined French court, Catherine had learned about affection, flirtation, and intimacy in a half-secret manner, through the scattered attention of older men and the mischievous curiosity of youth. Unfortunately, those earlier experiences clung to her like shadows, shadows that would one day rise to destroy her. When she married Henry, Catherine seemed genuinely delighted. Perhaps it was the crown, the jewels, the adoration of a king who treated her like a precious treasure. Or perhaps it was simply the thrill of being queen, a position few dared even dream of. But she did not fully understand the weight of her role. She had stepped into a palace where secrets were currency, where every whisper mattered, where a single rumour could birth a catastrophe. To Henry, she was pure, innocent, untouched by sorrow or scandal. To the court, she was something else entirely, a girl with a past that was not as pristine as her laughter suggested. At first, these were only murmurs, pushed aside by the king's overwhelming joy. Catherine danced at feasts, glided through corridors, delighted the king with youthful affection, and found herself surrounded by courtiers who sought her favour. Among them was Thomas Culpeper, a handsome and charismatic gentleman of the king's privy chamber. He was close to Henry, trusted by him, and his presence at court had an air of bold charm. For Catherine, Culpeper's admiration was dangerous. It reminded her of the attention she had known before her marriage, thrilling, flattering, and easy. Whether Catherine had genuine feelings for him, or whether she was merely playing with fire out of naive impulse, no one knew for certain. But in a court as hungry for scandal as Henry's, temptation never walked alone. It came accompanied by watchers, whisperers, and opportunists. Then there was Francis Derham, a man from Catherine's past, who had once been her lover within the Duchess's household. A foolish, arrogant man, one who believed that his past familiarity with Catherine granted him a special place even after she became queen. Bringing him to court was Catherine's most reckless mistake. His presence was a spark near dry parchment, one that only needed a slight breeze to burst into flame. And that breeze arrived in the form of enemies. Enemies who wanted to strike at the Howard family. Enemies who envied Catherine's sudden rise. Enemies who understood that Henry's infatuation was a fragile, volatile thing. The first whispers reached Archbishop Cranmer, a man who had survived Henry's storms by carefully balancing obedience with integrity. At first, he resisted believing the rumours. Catherine was so young, so adored by the king. Surely she would not risk everything for a foolish fling. But then more information arrived. Stories from her youth, Derham's presence, Culpeper's late-night visits, letters, servants testifying about secret meetings. Cranmer knew what this meant. In Henry's court, what began as rumour could become death. But silence was not protection either. He wrestled with the burden until he finally approached the king. Henry was in church, hearing Mass, when Cranmer delicately placed a letter in his hands. A letter describing the Queen's alleged misconduct. The king read it, stopped, read it again, and then the colour drained from his face. The man who had called Catherine his rose without a thorn was suddenly confronted with accusations that shattered his romantic illusions. For a moment, Henry refused to believe it. He shouted, paced, swore that the Queen was innocent. He raged against his counsellors for daring to accuse her. But as evidence mounted, disbelief transformed into a fury so sharp, so personal, that even the walls of the palace seemed to tremble. Catherine, confronted with her past, panicked. Her youth showed in every breath, every trembling answer, every plea for mercy. She confessed to past indiscretions, those from before her marriage, but denied any treasonous adultery after becoming queen. Yet the investigation unfolded swiftly and mercilessly. Derham was arrested first. He, foolishly believing he could protect himself, implicated Culpeper. Culpeper, terrified, confessed his meetings with Catherine, though he insisted nothing had happened. Whether this was true or not, it no longer mattered. In Henry's world, A whisper could become a truth, simply because he chose to believe it. The king was devastated, humiliated, his pride carved open, his heart bruised beyond repair. He had believed Catherine's innocence, rejoiced in her youth, revelled in her affection. Now he saw betrayal in every smile she had given him, every dance, every playful word. He withdrew from court, trembling with rage and sorrow. The heartbreak that Catherine Howard inflicted was more painful than Anne Boleyn's, because Henry had been so certain, so utterly convinced, that this time he had chosen someone pure. Trials were held, verdicts were predetermined. Culpeper and Derham were executed, and Catherine, barely more than a girl, awaited her fate. On the morning of her execution, she was pale, terrified, her body shaking uncontrollably. Her words, it was said, were filled with regret. She wished she had been more worthy of her position. She wished she had been wiser. She wished she had known how dangerous the world of kings truly was. She approached the scaffold trembling like a child, stepping into darkness. And in a single stroke, swift, merciful compared to the fates of many, her life ended. The court, weary of tragedy, fell silent once more. And Henry retreated into himself, into food, into anger, into illness. He had lost youth, lost love, lost trust, and lost yet another wife to the machinery of his own volatile heart. But fate was not finished with him. There was still one more chapter to be written, one more queen to enter the story, one more woman strong enough to survive Henry's shadow. Her name was Catherine Parr, and she would not fear the king. She would heal him. When Catherine Howard's death echoed through the cold stone halls of the Tower, it left behind a silence that seemed to settle directly onto Henry's soul. The king, who had once dazzled Europe, now looked like a man weighed down by a shadow he could not escape. His heart, already bruised by loss upon loss, now bore a deeper wound, one carved not by politics or war, but by humiliation, betrayal, and the terror of growing old in a world that no longer feared his charm. He limped through Windsor and Hampton Court like a ghost trapped in his own body. His legs ached constantly. The ulcers wept. His once proud stride had transformed into a heavy, dragging shuffle. His clothes had to be widened again and again as his torso swelled. He grew irritable, unpredictable, and fiercely lonely. Even the courtiers, who once entertained him with music and hunting, now spoke in hushed tones, afraid of triggering his wrath. Yet for all his physical decline, Henry remained a king, dangerous, unpredictable, and hungry for legacy. England was changing around him. Catholic Europe condemned him. Protestant reformers pressed him. His own nobles watched him with wary eyes, calculating how close they could stand without being burned by his anger. And in the midst of this storm, a woman entered the court, not with glamour, nor youth, nor flirtation, but with intelligence, calm strength, and something Henry had not encountered in years, gentle confidence. Her name was Catherine Parr. She was not a girl. She was not naive. She was not dazzled by royalty. Catherine was a woman who had lived, loved, and lost. A wealthy widow twice over, she understood the fragility of life. She understood responsibility, compromise, diplomacy, and the subtle power of kindness. All qualities Henry had not seen in a wife for a very long time. She had sharp intelligence, a mind shaped by books, theology, and reflection. She was devout, thoughtful, and, quietly but unmistakably, a supporter of religious reform. Yet she was also careful, skilled at reading people, skilled at navigating the dangerous currents of court politics. When she entered Henry's orbit, she did so with composure, not fear. Henry found her presence comforting. She listened to him. She did not provoke him. She neither challenged him as Anne Boleyn had, nor flattered him superficially as Catherine Howard had. Instead, Catherine Parr offered him something far more valuable: understanding. She treated him not only as a king, but as a man, an aging, wounded, powerful man who had spent years drowning in his own contradictions. For a while, Catherine had no desire to marry Henry. She had fallen in love with another man, Thomas Seymour, the brother of Jane Seymour. But when the king proposed, every instinct for survival told her she could not refuse. In Henry's world, a no could be fatal. And so, with a quiet sense of duty and a prayer for strength, she accepted the proposal. The marriage that followed was unlike any Henry had experienced. Catherine Parr was not a woman obsessed with status or jewels. She was not consumed by romantic passion or personal ambition. She saw her queenship as a responsibility, an opportunity to heal a fractured family and a fractured kingdom. Her influence began at home. Mary, Henry's eldest daughter, still carried deep emotional wounds from her mother, Catherine of Aragon's banishment. Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, had grown up brilliant but wary, always aware that her mother's death lingered in the shadows of her identity. Edward, the young prince, was studious and impressionable. Catherine Parr brought these three children together. She encouraged them to learn languages, theology, philosophy. She oversaw their tutors. She ensured they spent time together. She taught them the value of unity in a divided nation. Under her guidance, Mary softened. Elizabeth blossomed intellectually. Edward became disciplined and curious. For the first time in decades, Henry's household felt like a family instead of a battlefield of rival loyalties. And Catherine's influence did not stop there. Henry's health was failing, and she stepped into the role of caretaker with devotion. She helped manage his ulcers, ensured his physicians attended him properly, and soothed his moods with patience few had ever shown him. When Henry's mind grew clouded with paranoia or anger, Catherine remained steady. She waited, she listened, she calmed. But Catherine Parr was more than a caretaker. She was a thinker, a writer, a reform-minded intellectual. She wrote prayers and meditations that expressed personal faith, and she became the first Queen of England to publish a book under her own name. Her ideas, gentle but progressive, drew admiration from many reformers and danger from their enemies. For while Catherine helped keep the royal household peaceful, the political landscape around her was erupting in quiet conflict. Conservative factions in the court, particularly those loyal to the old Catholic order, saw her influence as a threat. They whispered that she was pushing Henry toward Protestant radicalism. They watched her with suspicion, waiting for a misstep. And one day, their opportunity arrived. Henry was growing older, more irritable, and more uncertain of the world he had created. His mind, once sharp and confident, now swung between inspiration and insecurity. Into this unstable atmosphere, Catherine made a mistake. She challenged Henry on religious matters during one of his more sensitive moods. To Catherine, it was simply a debate, a continuation of their usual theological discussions. She believed Henry valued honest conversation, but that day, Henry's pride flared. He interpreted her argument not as intellectual engagement, but as defiance. Whispers reached the Conservatives. They saw an opening, They moved swiftly. They approached Henry with warnings. Catherine was a heretic, a Protestant radical, a woman who used scripture to undermine his authority. They insinuated that she wished to control him, to manipulate him through faith. The king, already fatigued and suspicious, allowed doubt to creep into his heart. Soon, an arrest warrant was drafted. Catherine Parr, Queen of England, healer of the royal household, mother figure to 3 heirs, was to be seized and questioned for her beliefs. But fate had always been curious with Catherine Parr. She was intelligent, she was perceptive, and by chance, or divine protection, she discovered the plans against her before they could be carried out. Terrified, but desperate, she approached Henry at a moment when his anger had cooled. She spoke carefully, humbly, framing her debates not as challenges, but as attempts to learn from the king's superior wisdom. She praised his knowledge. She softened his pride. She soothed his ego. And remarkably, Henry relented. When the guards arrived the next day to arrest her, Henry lashed out at them, mocking them, scolding them, pretending he had never intended such a thing. Catherine Parr had survived the king's most dangerous weapon, his insecurity, and so she remained queen. But outside their private chambers, the world was growing harsher. Henry's health continued to deteriorate. His once robust frame had become so heavy that special wheeled mechanisms were needed to move him. His legs throbbed with infection. His temper became unpredictable. His mind, strained by pain and age, drifted between clarity and confusion. Yet he still acted as king. He still sought to lead. He still dreamed of war. Foreign enemies saw his weakness. France and Scotland tested England's strength repeatedly. Henry responded with campaigns that drained the treasury and exhausted the army. But he could not accept appearing weak. Not now. Not ever. In these final years, Catherine Parr became more than a wife. She became Henry's shield, his caretaker, his diplomat, his steadying force. She urged reconciliation between Henry and his daughters. She ensured Elizabeth and Mary were restored to the line of succession. She protected scholars he admired. She softened political rivalries that threatened to ignite. Through her efforts, the Tudor family, fractured by decades of jealousy, betrayal, and religious conflict, began to mend, thread by delicate thread. Yet even Catherine Parr could not halt the one battle Henry could never win: his own body. The king who had once wrestled, jousted, danced, and hunted now spent nights gasping for breath, sweating through pain, groaning under the weight of his failing health. His courtiers tiptoed, doctors muttered, servants averted their eyes. The king was dying, not suddenly, but slowly, inch by inch, and in that slow descent, Catherine Parr remained beside him, calm, prayerful, dignified. She would be the only wife to survive him. But Henry, even at the end, had more than one final impact left waiting for the world: the succession, the future of England, the destiny of the Tudor dynasty. Everything that would come next, the tragedy of Edward, the fire of Mary, and the golden brilliance of Elizabeth, was already written in the life of the king taking his final breaths. As Henry's body weakened, the world around him seemed to shrink. The vast palaces he once strode through with thunderous energy now felt like silent labyrinths echoing with his labored breathing. Rooms that once resounded with music, feasts, and flirtation now smelled of medicine, damp linen, and the metallic scent of festering wounds. The king, who had once inspired fear merely by entering a hall, was now being lifted in mechanical chairs, moved by attendants who hid their pity behind rehearsed expressions. But even in these deteriorating years, Henry's mind clung to the question that had haunted him since youth. What will happen to England when I am gone? All his life, Henry had believed himself chosen by God to protect the Tudor dynasty. Yet fate had played cruelly with his hopes. His beloved son, Edward, was still a child, bright, disciplined, studious, and devout, but far too young to rule alone. His daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, brilliant in their own ways, were reminders of the wives he had wronged, the marriages that had shattered, the political storms he had unleashed. England needed stability. Henry needed to ensure that his legacy, bloodline, religion, and authority would survive his death. And so, surrounded by counselors, bishops, and lawyers, the king began the final great task of his reign, shaping the future without him. Catherine Parr remained by his side, encouraging a reconciliation among his children. She knew Edward would need the support of his sisters. She knew Mary, though older, held resentment and sorrow in her heart. She knew Elizabeth, though brilliant, would have to navigate a world that distrusted powerful women. Catherine worked tirelessly, softly, invisibly, to tie these fractured siblings together with delicate threads of loyalty. And Henry, surprisingly, listened. In a moment of clarity, one rare spark amidst the fog of pain, Henry restored both Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession. It was a monumental decision. Decades of harsh decrees were reversed with a single signature. The Tudor line, once fractured, was made whole again on parchment, though emotional scars lingered beneath the surface. Outside the palace walls, however, England trembled. The realm was nearly bankrupt. The religious landscape was scarred. Wars with France and Scotland drained resources. Foreign enemies watched eagerly. Even within England, nobles eyed one another suspiciously, each calculating their place in the future regency. Henry's power, though weakened physically, remained absolute. No one dared question him directly, but in shadowed alcoves and private chambers, noble factions whispered. Reformers hoped Edward's reign would strengthen Protestantism. Conservatives hoped the young king could be steered back toward Catholic traditions. Ambition sharpened like knives. And through it all, Henry clung to his sense of destiny. He believed England would endure, not because of its armies or wealth, but because of the Tudor blood in Edward's veins. That belief became his anchor in the storm of decline. The king's health spiraled further. His legs, swollen and infected, were wrapped in bandages that needed near constant changing. Each touch sent waves of agony through him. He could no longer mount a horse. He could no longer walk unaided. His chest tightened with fluid. His breathing grew ragged. His face, once flushed with the vitality of youth, turned pale and puffy. And yet the king insisted on ruling until his final breath. Meetings were held around his bed. Councillors stood silently as he issued orders with a trembling voice. His temper sparked unpredictably. One moment, he was lucid, thoughtful, even tender. The next, he exploded in fury, accusing those around him of betrayal or incompetence. Henry's decline was not merely physical, it was psychological, a slow unraveling of the image he had clung to his entire life. He had once been a golden prince, then a warrior king, then a husband determined to defy heaven, then a monarch who reshaped religion, then a flame fed by obsession, and finally, a dying man struggling to understand the meaning of all he had done. in the quiet hours of the night, when the candles burned low and servants stepped carefully through the dark, Henry was left alone with memories that flickered like ghosts in the corners of his mind. Catherine of Aragon's dignity, Anne Boleyn's laughter, and then her terror, Jane Seymour's gentle smile, Anne of Cleve's kind eyes, Catherine Howard's frightened sobs, Catherine Parr's steady presence, 6 women whose lives had been forever altered by the orbit of his desire, his ambition, his fear. He thought of his children, his lost sons, his surviving daughters, his long-awaited heir. He wondered if God had punished him or simply guided him. He wondered if his choices had been just, or if everything he had done, breaking from Rome, seizing church lands, executing advisers and wives, had been nothing more than the flailing of a man terrified of weakness. The winter of 1547 was mercilessly cold. The fires burned constantly in Henry's chambers, yet the king shivered beneath layers of velvet and fur. Catherine Parr remained with him, praying softly as his breath grew shallower. Doctors bickered quietly over treatments. Courtiers waited anxiously outside the door. The kingdom held its breath. On the 28th of January, 1547, Henry VIII, King of England, took his final breath. The man who had dominated Europe's stage for nearly 4 decades, who broke from Rome, who married 6 times, who reshaped his entire nation with a stubborn, relentless will, was gone. The palace fell into silence. Bells tolled. Courtiers bowed their heads. Across England, people whispered prayers for the king's soul, though not all were certain what kind of judgment awaited him. Henry had ordered that he be buried beside Jane Seymour, the wife who gave him the son he had longed for and the only woman he claimed to have truly loved. And so the king rested in the cold stone vault of St. George's Chapel, Windsor, beside the Queen whose memory had never left him. But Henry's story did not end with his burial. It continued in the trembling steps of his 9-year-old son, Edward. It echoed in the fierce decisions of his daughter Mary. It erupted in the brilliant reign of his daughter Elizabeth, a child Henry once considered a disappointment, but who would rise to become one of the greatest monarchs in history. Henry's life had been a storm, but his legacy would become a nation's transformation. The echoes of his choices were just beginning. When Henry VIII's coffin was lowered toward the stone vault beneath St. George's Chapel, the air inside Windsor hung heavy, not with the grief of a beloved monarch, but with the weight of a man whose life had left deep, permanent marks on the soul of a nation. Horses in black plumes pulled the funeral carriage, drums thudded in steady rhythm, and the cold January wind whispered through the cloisters like a final breath escaping the world he had shaped. Outside the chapel, crowds gathered silently. Some mourned sincerely. Some watched with curiosity. Others whispered with unease, uncertain whether to fear the future or hope for it. Because Henry, for all his contradictions, had been a force no one could ignore. He had ruled with fire, pride, and frightening certainty. And now, for the first time in nearly 4 decades, England braced itself for a new ruler. The crown passed to his 9-year-old son, Edward VI, a child with golden hair, solemn eyes, and a mind far older than his age. Edward had been raised under the strict guidance of scholars and reformers. He knew Latin, theology, mathematics, Greek. He had memorized entire passages of Scripture, and he carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone aware that destiny had placed a heavy crown upon a small head. But Edward was still a child, and a child king is never truly a king. Behind him, powerful men moved into position. The most prominent of them, Edward Seymour, the young king's uncle, would shape the realm with ambition and arrogance. Though this documentary is about Henry, the consequences of his choices were now unfolding through others. Parliament accelerated religious reforms, pushing England further from Catholic traditions. Churches changed, priests changed, worship changed, the very sound of prayer changed. Henry had set the wheel in motion, but it was his son's reign that turned it rapidly. Edward, brilliant but frail, burned with a desire to complete his father's legacy. He pushed for a kingdom defined by Protestant identity. But his body, delicate since birth, could not withstand the pressures of rule. And so, at just 15 years old, King Edward VI died, tragically young, tragically brilliant, tragically unfinished. Another Tudor funeral, another Tudor tragedy. And now, the crown passed not to a boy, but to a woman whose path had been carved by suffering. Mary, Henry's eldest daughter, once declared illegitimate, once banished, once broken-hearted, now stepped into the throne with a determination forged in the years of humiliation. Mary Tudor had endured more sorrow than most monarchs could fathom. She had watched her mother cast aside, her faith attacked, her status revoked. The girl who had once been a cherished princess had grown into a woman hardened by silence, prayer, and wounds that never fully healed. When she became queen at 37, she carried a fire in her soul, a fire fueled by devotion to the Catholic faith and the memory of her mother, Catherine of Aragon. Mary believed it was her divine duty to restore England to the Church of Rome, and so she acted with the same unbending conviction that had once defined her father. But unlike Henry, Mary did not temper conviction with charisma. Her decisions, though born from faith, ignited conflict. Executions followed, heresy trials multiplied, smoke rose from burning pyres, fears spread across England, and Mary Tudor, in the eyes of history, earned a name that would overshadow her complexities, Bloody Mary. Yet even Mary's reign, intense and tragic, was not the Tudor legacy's final shape, because waiting in the shadows was another daughter, a daughter Henry had once dismissed, a daughter born from a marriage he destroyed, a daughter he had declared illegitimate, then restored, then ignored. Elizabeth. She had inherited her mother Anne Boleyn's sharp wit, her father's intelligence, and a resilience forged from uncertainty. Elizabeth Tudor had watched siblings rise and fall, watched religion tear the nation apart, watched fear govern royal decisions. She knew danger intimately, but she also understood people, politics, and power with remarkable insight. When Mary died at 42, worn down by stress and illness, Elizabeth ascended the throne. The moment she stepped into the spotlight, the atmosphere of the realm changed. People looked at her not with fear, but with cautious hope. She was 25, young, brilliant, and determined. Her reign would not simply undo Henry's damage, it would redefine England entirely. Elizabeth restored stability after decades of chaos. She discouraged religious extremism from both sides. She balanced diplomacy and force with uncanny precision. She resisted marriage, understanding that a queen married was a queen shared. And under her leadership, England flourished. Theatres thrived, Shakespeare wrote. Explorers sailed farther than before. Trade expanded, culture blossomed. England transformed into a major European power, not through brutality, but through caution, intelligence, and tolerance. And in the quiet corners of her court, Elizabeth carried memories of her father, not with bitterness or admiration, but with something deeper, understanding. Henry had shaped her world, shaped her traumas, shaped her throne. Elizabeth recognized both the fire and the destruction he had left behind, and she learned from him. Henry VIII's legacy did not die with him. It lived in the son who tried to complete his religious revolution. It lived in the daughter who tried to restore the old faith. And it lived most brilliantly in the daughter who forged a new England out of the ashes of her family's turmoil. History remembers Henry as a tyrant, a romantic, a hypocrite, a visionary, a monster, and a man who devoured everything he touched, including his own happiness. But he was also the catalyst of a transformation that would echo far beyond the Tudor era. His flaws and ambitions, his loves and losses, his triumphs and tragedies, together they set the stage for one of the most remarkable periods in English history. And perhaps the greatest irony of all is this: Henry destroyed so much in his desperate pursuit of a son, yet it was his daughter Elizabeth, the child he once considered a disappointment, who carried the Tudor name to its brightest glory. In the end, Henry VIII was neither wholly villain nor wholly hero. He was a storm, destructive, breathtaking, unforgettable, and the landscape of England was forever changed by his passing. In the long tapestry of history, few figures cast a shadow as vast, as contradictory, and as unforgettable as Henry VIII. His life unfolded like a great tempest, thrilling, devastating, unpredictable, leaving behind a kingdom forever altered by his passions and fears. He did not merely rule England. He tore it apart, rebuilt it, reshaped it, and then left it trembling as he vanished into the quiet stone of his tomb. Yet even now, centuries later, we stand in the wake of that storm, looking back at the ruins and the triumphs he left behind. Behind the broad shoulders, the golden armor, the thunderous laughter that echoed through palaces, there lived a boy who once wanted simply to be loved, a boy who grew up believing he was chosen by God, a boy who became a king before he knew how heavy a crown could be. He began as a prince of almost unreal promise, handsome, athletic, educated, adored, a Renaissance ideal. And yet, beneath the brilliance, cracks formed early, cracks of insecurity, cracks of ambition, cracks of a man who feared loss more than he feared God. Those cracks widened with every tragedy, the loss of sons, the pressure of legacy, the fear of being forgotten, the desire for control. And in those widening fractures, the world around him trembled. 6 women entered his life, each bearing her own hopes, fears, dreams, each standing in the path of a king who loved fiercely and destroyed just as fiercely. Catherine of Aragon, dignified and unwavering, who gave him loyalty even when he broke her heart. Anne Boleyn, brilliant and bold, whose spark set fire to the old world and cost her everything. Jane Seymour, gentle and tender, who gave him the son he longed for and paid for it with her life. Anne of Cleves, kind and pragmatic, who survived because she never tried to love a king who could not love in return. Catherine Howard, young and frightened, who danced too close to danger and met a tragic end. And Catherine Parr, wise and steady, who healed a king when no one else could, and helped bind together the fractured children he left behind. Their stories are not footnotes in Henry's life. They are the heartbeat of it. Through them, we glimpse the man behind the legend, the vulnerabilities he hid, the damage he inflicted, and the humanity he could never fully escape. Henry had dreamed of founding a dynasty stronger than any that came before. He believed his son Edward would cement that destiny. But Edward's reign flickered like a candle in the wind. Mary's reign flared with the fire of old faith, but burned too hot, too fast. And then came Elizabeth, his daughter by Anne Boleyn, the child who entered the world wrapped not in celebration, but in disappointment. She became everything Henry had hoped a son would be: a ruler of iron and velvet, a strategist, a survivor, a sovereign who understood her people in a way Henry never could. Under Elizabeth, England rose from the turbulence of Henry's chaos and transformed into a nation of exploration, art, literature, and unshakable identity. The Elizabethan age shone like gold, and its glow softened the shadows carved by Henry's reign. So what, then, is Henry VIII's legacy? Is he the tyrant who executed wives, crushed rebellions, and tore a nation from its ancient church? Yes. Is he the visionary monarch whose decisions forged a new identity for England and paved the way for centuries of transformation? Yes. Is he the proud king who desired power more than peace, or the wounded man who desired love more than forgiveness? He was both. He was all of it. A man made of contradictions. Magnificent, monstrous, magnetic. History rarely grants its characters the courtesy of being simple. Henry VIII was not simple. He was a storm. And storms do not pass quietly. They leave behind new landscapes. When Henry died, the world he shaped was unstable, fractured, and uncertain. But from that fractured world came a dynasty of rulers who would define England in ways Henry never imagined. Edward, the fleeting promise; Mary, the burning flame; Elizabeth, the golden legacy. All three bore pieces of their father within them. All three walked paths carved by his choices. All three ruled a kingdom forever changed by the man who had feared failure more than death. And so, as we close the final chapter of this story, we look back not at a villain or a hero, but at a human being, a man woven from ambition and insecurity, brilliance and cruelty, desperation and triumph, a king who rose like a blazing star, fell like a collapsing monument, and left behind echoes that still whisper through England's history. Henry VIII is remembered not because he was perfect, but because he was unforgettable, a king whose life was a storm and whose aftermath became a nation.